In 1588, Sir Francis Drake was the hero who saved England. He stood on the deck of his ship, the Revenge, a defiant bulldog of a man, watching as the invincible Spanish Armada was broken and scattered to the winds. It was a victory that cemented his legend as one of history's greatest naval commanders, a triumph so complete it felt like divine intervention. But what if I told you that just 1 year later, this same national hero would lead England into its single greatest naval disaster? A catastrophe so profound, so humiliating, that it was deliberately scrubbed from the pages of English history. This is the untold story of the English Armada, a tale of ambition, failure, and a national shame that forever tarnished a legend's name. The year is 1588. England is euphoric. Bonfires light up the hills from Dover to Carlisle. Church bells are ringing, and a medal is struck with the triumphant inscription, "God blew, and they were scattered." The great Spanish Armada, King Philip II's grand crusade to dethrone the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I, lay in ruins. Of the roughly 130 ships that had sailed against England, only about half would ever make it back to Spain. It was a stunning, almost miraculous victory. For a small island nation, it was their finest hour. At the heart of this victory were two figures. Queen Elizabeth, who had donned a silver breastplate to rally her troops with a speech that would echo through the ages, and her favorite pirate, the man the Spanish called El Draque, the dragon, Sir Francis Drake. He was the bold, brilliant and ruthless vice-admiral of the English fleet. Years before, he had singed the King of Spain's beard with a daring raid on the port of Cadiz, and now he had helped burn the king's whole navy. Drake wasn't just a hero, he was the living embodiment of England's defiant spirit. His popularity had never been higher. In the wake of this triumph, however, a dangerous mood settled over the English court, a mix of overconfidence and a thirst for payback. The war with Spain wasn't over. King Philip, though staggered, was not broken. His vast American empire continued to pump gold and silver into his coffers, allowing him to rebuild his forces with terrifying speed. Elizabeth and her council knew that 1588 wasn't a knockout blow. They believed Spain was on its knees, vulnerable. This was the moment, they argued, not just to defend England, but to destroy Spain's capacity to ever wage war again. Out of this atmosphere of hubris, a grand plan was born. A plan of breathtaking audacity. They wouldn't just repeat Drake's raid on Cadiz, they would launch their own invincible armada. This expedition, known to history as the English Armada, had three devastating objectives. First, they would sail to the northern coast of Spain, to Santander and San Sebastian, where the battered remnants of the 1588 Armada were being repaired. They would burn the Spanish fleet to the waterline, a sound, strategic military goal. Second, they would sail to Portugal. At the time, Portugal was unwillingly ruled by the Spanish king. The English had a claimant to the Portuguese throne living in exile in London, a man named Dom Antonio. The plan was to land an English army, rally the supposedly resentful Portuguese populace, and spark a rebellion. This would not only deprive Spain of Portugal's wealth, but also give England a powerful ally right on the Iberian Peninsula. Third, and most tantalizingly, the fleet would then seize the Azores Islands. This small Atlantic archipelago was the crucial rest stop for the Spanish treasure fleets. By capturing the Azores, England could strangle Spain's economy at its source, intercepting its wealth and funding the war with Spanish gold. Destroy the fleet, liberate Portugal, and capture the treasure. It was a plan to win the entire war in a single campaign. But this grand strategy had a fatal flaw: its funding. Queen Elizabeth, famously frugal, was unwilling to bankroll such a massive operation herself. While she provided a few royal galleons and about a quarter of the cost, the rest had to be raised privately. The English Armada was therefore a joint stock venture, the 16th century equivalent of a startup, and everyone wanted in. Nobles and merchants invested heavily, buying shares in the expedition and hoping for a spectacular return. This created a toxic conflict of interest. The Queen wanted strategic victories. The private investors, including Drake himself, wanted one thing above all: profit. This tension between military duty and the pursuit of treasure would haunt the expedition from the very start. To lead this colossal undertaking, two commanders were chosen. The land forces, an army of nearly 25,000 men, would be commanded by Sir John Norreys, a seasoned and respected soldier. The fleet, the largest England had ever assembled, nearly 200 ships, would be commanded by the nation's darling, Sir Francis Drake. On paper, a dream team. England's greatest soldier and England's greatest sailor. In reality, it was a clash of personalities waiting to happen. Norreys was a professional soldier focused on objectives. Drake was a brilliant buccaneer whose instincts always pulled him toward the promise of plunder. As the ships and men gathered in Plymouth in the spring of 1589, the scale was staggering, significantly larger than the Spanish Armada it was meant to counter. But a closer look would have revealed worrying signs. The soldiers were mostly raw volunteers, undisciplined and unequipped, lured by promises of Spanish gold. The fleet was a chaotic mix of warships and hastily converted merchant vessels. This wasn't a professional military operation. It was a sprawling, privately funded gamble. And at its head was a hero about to be tested in a way he had never been before. Before a single ship left English waters, the expedition began to fall apart. The fleet was supposed to sail in February, to strike Spain before it could recover. But day after day, week after week, fierce westerly gales pinned the ships in Plymouth Harbor. This delay was catastrophic. The expedition had been provisioned for a swift campaign. Now, thousands of men were stuck on crowded ships, consuming food and beer at an alarming rate. Barrels of beef and biscuits meant for the invasion of Spain were being devoured while the fleet sat helplessly at anchor. The logistical nightmare spiraled. The raw, undisciplined volunteers grew bored and restless. Fights broke out. They started looting the very town hosting them. Men who had signed up for a glorious adventure began deserting, slipping away into the night. Even more critically, the winds prevented the arrival of the most important part of Norreys' army, his veteran troops from the Netherlands. These were hardened professionals, the disciplined core the army was supposed to be built around. They were also bringing crucial siege cannons, but they were stuck in Dutch ports, facing the same impossible winds. Drake and Norreys faced an agonizing choice: wait indefinitely, burning through their remaining supplies and risking the complete collapse of their force, or sail with what they had, a poorly trained, underfed army with no siege equipment. The pressure from investors was immense. Finally, in mid-April, with supplies critically low, they made the fateful decision to go. They would sail without the veteran troops and without a proper siege train. On April 28, 1589, the winds finally turned. The great English Armada, a sprawling forest of masts, limped out of Plymouth, 2 months late, undermanned, undersupplied, and heading toward the most powerful empire on earth. The omens were not good. The Queen's orders were crystal clear. The number one priority was to sail directly to Santander and destroy the recovering Spanish fleet. Only after that was done were they to proceed to Portugal. But as the English fleet battled south, Sir Francis Drake made a decision that would change everything. Citing unfavorable winds that he claimed made it impossible to reach Santander, he ordered the fleet to change course. Their new destination wasn't the harbor full of warships, but the wealthy mercantile port of Corunna. Was it really the wind? Or was it the siren song of plunder? Corunna had no significant part of the Armada fleet. What it did have was a reputation for wealth. For Drake, the admiral of a joint stock company hemorrhaging money, the pressure from his investors was immense. They hadn't invested in a naval blockade. They had invested in El Drake to bring them treasure. Santander offered a strategic victory, but little loot. Corunna promised a quick, profitable raid. Drake, the pirate at heart, chose Corunna. This infuriated Sir John Norreys. He knew attacking Corunna squandered their most valuable asset: surprise. It was a dereliction of duty, putting personal profit over national security. The conflict between the two commanders was about to boil over. On May 4th, the English descended upon the unsuspecting city. The initial assault was a success. Norreys's troops stormed ashore and quickly overran the lower town. What followed was not a military operation, but a chaotic sack. The ill-disciplined English soldiers ran riot, plundering houses, ransacking wine cellars, and feasting on captured food. They drank themselves into a stupor on the city's vast stores of wine. But the real prize, the fortified upper town, held firm. The Spanish governor gathered his soldiers and the town's citizens inside its strong medieval walls. Lacking the heavy siege cannons they'd left behind, the English were forced to try and take the fortress by storm. They launched a series of desperate, bloody assaults. They tried to blow a breach in the walls, but the explosion was miscalculated and killed many of their own men. When they charged the breach, they were met by ferocious resistance from the Spanish garrison and the ordinary men and women of the city. This is where Corunna's own legend was born. A woman named Maria Pita. Seeing her husband killed, she supposedly snatched up a spear, killed the English officer leading the charge, and rallied the defenders, who furiously drove the English back from the walls. For 2 weeks, the English battered themselves against the fortress. Disease, typhus, and dysentery began to tear through their camp, fueled by poor sanitation and drunken excess. Men who weren't killed in the assaults began dying in their tents. By mid-May, it was clear the siege had failed. They had suffered thousands of casualties, lost precious time, and gained little of strategic value. The plunder was nowhere near enough to cover the expedition's costs. Worse, a Spanish relief army was now marching toward Corunna. On May 18th, Drake and Norreys made the humiliating decision to abandon the siege. They re-embarked their sick and demoralized troops, leaving behind a burning lower town and a defiant, victorious citadel. The attack on Corunna was a catastrophic blunder. It had cost them men, time, and the element of surprise. The primary objective, destroying the Armada fleet at Santander, was now impossible. Drake had gambled, putting profit before duty, and he had lost. The expedition was only a month old, and it was already careening toward disaster. Having failed at Corunna, the battered English Armada limped south. Their primary objective was now a fantasy, so all hopes rested on the second, sparking a revolution in Portugal. The plan was simple. Norreys would land the army and march overland to Lisbon. Drake would sail the fleet to the mouth of the Tagus River and meet him there, providing the naval firepower to smash the city's defenses. The entire plan depended on one assumption, that as soon as the pretender, Dom Antonio, set foot on Portuguese soil, the people would rise up in joyous revolt. In late May, the English landed at Peniche, about 50 miles north of Lisbon. The disembarkation was a mess. The impetuous young Earl of Essex, a favorite of the Queen who had joined against her orders, jumped into the surf with his followers and waded ashore, nearly drowning himself in a fit of bravado. Once ashore, Norreys assembled his force of around 11,000 men, a shadow of the army that had left England. They were tired, sick, and short on food. Critically, they had no cavalry and no siege train. They were a huge, lumbering mass of infantry about to march deep into enemy territory with no support. Their only hope was Dom Antonio. As he was paraded through the coastal towns, the response was lukewarm. A few locals came out, but the promised mass uprising never happened. The Portuguese peasants were wary. They disliked Spanish rule, but they feared the consequences of a failed rebellion even more. They saw a sick, starving English army and a powerless pretender. It wasn't an inspiring sight. Nevertheless, Norreys pressed on. In what would prove to be the expedition's single greatest tactical error, the forces were split. Norreys and his army began the grueling 75-kilometer march to Lisbon. Drake took the fleet and promised to meet them at the city. The march became a waking nightmare. The Spanish had implemented a scorched earth policy, removing all food from the path of the English advance. The sun beat down mercilessly. Starvation set in. Soldiers drank from stagnant pools, and disease exploded through the ranks. Dysentery and typhus tore through the army. Men fell by the wayside, too weak to continue. The line of march became a trail of the dead and dying. Starving soldiers deserted, only to be picked off by Spanish patrols. The Grand Army of Liberation had devolved into a desperate, stumbling mob. By the time Norris's skeletal army finally staggered to the outskirts of Lisbon, he had lost thousands more men without fighting a single major battle. And the most important question on his mind was the same one on every soldier's: where was Drake? This campaign was one of the most ambitious undertakings in English history, but it's often overshadowed by the more famous victory against the Spanish Armada. If you're finding this deep dive into forgotten history fascinating, take a moment to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button. It allows us to keep digging up these incredible, untold stories. Now back to the disaster at Lisbon. When Sir John Norris and his ragged army arrived before Lisbon in early June 1589, the sight that greeted them was crushing. The city was not in rebellion. There were no welcoming crowds. Instead, the walls were heavily manned with well-armed Spanish troops. The promised popular uprising was a fiction. In a moment of black comedy, when Dom Antonio rode near the walls and called on his loyal subjects to rise up, he was met with jeers and gunfire. Norris's position was hopeless. His army was on the verge of collapse. Thousands were sick, and the rest was starving. They had no siege cannons, no ladders, and no energy for an assault. They camped outside the city, a pathetic ghost of an invading force, growing weaker by the day. All their hopes now rested on the fleet. Norris and his men scanned the horizon, desperately searching for Drake's sails on the Tagus River. The plan had been for Drake to force his way into the harbor and use his ship's cannons to bombard the city. It was the only way. But Drake never came. The English fleet was anchored at the mouth of the Tagus, tantalizingly close, but they made no move. Drake's excuse was that the river's entrance was heavily defended by forts and galleys. He argued that to risk the fleet, the army's only way home, would be reckless. His critics tell a different story. They argue that Drake, the shareholder, was unwilling to risk his investors' property. Most of the fleet consisted of private merchant ships. A battle in the Tagus would have meant heavy losses. Drake, the man who had fearlessly sailed into Cadiz harbor 2 years earlier, was now paralyzed by caution. Protecting his capital was more important than saving the army. He had risked everything for plunder at Corunna, but he would risk nothing for a strategic victory at Lisbon. Furious messages flew between the commanders. Norris, stranded outside the city, begged Drake to attack. Drake sent back excuses. The dream team of England's greatest soldier and sailor had devolved into a mess of blame and distrust. For several agonizing days, Norris waited as his army melted away. Finally, he had to face reality. The mission had failed. The order was given to retreat. The English army turned its back on Lisbon and began the humiliating march back to the coast, to rendezvous with the fleet they felt had betrayed them. Harassed by Spanish forces and still ravaged by disease, the army disintegrated further. Of the 11,000 men who had begun the march from Peniche, fewer than half were still fit for duty. The rest were dead, deserted, or dying. The invasion of Portugal was a complete and unmitigated catastrophe. The reunion of the army and the fleet was not a happy one. The soldiers who staggered aboard Drake's ships were ghosts, emaciated, sick, and filled with burning resentment for the sailors they believed had abandoned them. The holds of the ships, already foul and overcrowded, became floating hospitals filled with thousands of dying men. But the ordeal wasn't over. Drake, perhaps in a desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreck of the campaign, was not ready to go home empty-handed. He still clung to the third objective, the Azores treasure fleet. He gave orders to head out into the Atlantic to hunt for the Spanish silver galleons. But his force was in no condition for such a mission. The ships were in poor repair, the crews were exhausted and mutinous, and the fighting force was decimated. A portion of the fleet, under Norris, had had enough and sailed directly for England. Drake took the rest and split them into squadrons to patrol the shipping lanes. He captured a small convoy of merchant ships, but this meager prize was nothing. The great treasure fleet, having been warned of Drake's presence, slipped right past him. It was the final failure in a campaign defined by them. As if to add a final, cruel punctuation mark, a powerful storm struck the scattered English fleet on its way home. Already weakened, several ships foundered and sank, taking their entire crews with them. Throughout the late summer of 1589, the surviving ships of the English Armada straggled back into English ports. Their arrival was met not with celebration, but with horror. The people on the docks saw not conquering heroes, but floating coffins. Emaciated men were carried ashore, many dying on the docks. The stench of disease and death hung over the ships. The great enterprise had returned in tatters. When the final accounting was done, the numbers were staggering. Of the roughly 27,000 men who had sailed on the English Armada, it's estimated that between 15,000 and 20,000 never returned. The vast majority had died not in battle, but from disease and starvation. Around 40 ships had been lost. Proportionally, the losses were far greater than those suffered by the Spanish Armada the year before. England had lost well over half its force. It was, without question, the worst military and naval disaster in English history. The financial losses were just as devastating. The expedition had cost over $100,000, a colossal sum. The plunder brought back was valued at a paltry $30,000. It was a ruinous failure. Private investors were wiped out. The Queen had lost ships, men, and a huge amount of money. The blame game began immediately. Norreys blamed Drake for failing to attack at Lisbon. Drake blamed Norreys for the disastrous overland march. Both men submitted reports spinning the events to favor their own actions. An official inquiry was launched, but it quickly became clear that the English establishment had no appetite for a public reckoning. Acknowledging the full scale of the catastrophe would be too humiliating. It would shatter the myth of English invincibility built after 1588. It would hand a massive propaganda victory to Spain, which was already celebrating the defeat of El Draque. And so began one of the great cover-ups in English history. Official reports were censored. The disaster was spun as a partial success. They emphasized the sacking of Corunna's lower town, while deliberately downplaying the catastrophic loss of life and the utter failure to achieve any of the main objectives. Drake and Norreys, while temporarily falling from favor, were largely protected. The government couldn't afford to have its greatest heroes seen as architects of a national humiliation. The English people were simply told a sanitized version of events. There were no national days of mourning, no public inquiries. There was just silence. The story of the English Armada was quietly buried, erased from the popular narrative. While the victory of 1588 became a cornerstone of national identity, the disaster of 1589 became a forgotten footnote. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was an act of God. God blew, and they were scattered. But the English Armada was a man-made catastrophe, a failure of planning, leadership, and greed. And for that, there was no one to blame but themselves. The shame was so great that the nation chose collective amnesia over a painful truth. The story of the 1589 English Armada is a sobering cautionary tale. It reveals how quickly the arrogance of victory can lead to the humiliation of defeat. The very qualities that had made Sir Francis Drake a legend, his audacious courage and his relentless pursuit of profit, proved to be his undoing when placed in command of a complex military operation. He was a brilliant pirate, but a flawed admiral. The expedition was doomed by a toxic cocktail of conflicting motives, the strategic goals of the state versus the financial greed of its investors. It was crippled by catastrophic planning and undone by a divided command. The hero of 1588 became the architect of the 1589 disaster, a truth so inconvenient that England decided to simply forget it ever happened. It's a stark reminder that history isn't just written by the victors, it's often rewritten by the losers to hide their most painful failures. If you enjoyed this look into a forgotten chapter of military history, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button to help us bring more of these hidden stories to light. Let us know in the comments what other historical myths or cover-ups you'd like to see us investigate next. Thanks for watching.